Everybody. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Scott French. I'm an Associate Professor of History and Director of Public History here at UCF. And I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the University of Central Florida, the College of Arts and Humanities, and the Department of History for this wonderful event, a day of events. It's amazing what we have in store for you here today. I have a very easy task. My job is to introduce my colleague, Dr. Connie Lester, and I'm going to keep that brief, but just to let you know, she's the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly and also directs our Riches digital archive repository, which is an amazing thing. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Lester. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry we had a little kerfuffle there, but we seem to be underway now. Welcome to the 7th annual Jerrell Shofner Lecture on Florida history. Let me say just a few words about the lecture and its origins. The lecture series is an outreach of the Florida Historical Quarterly, which is the peer-reviewed scholarly publication of the Florida Historical Society. The offices for the Quarterly are in the History Department here at UCF. The Society headquarters are in Cocoa. The Florida Historical Quarterly is in its 98th year of publication and came to UCF from the University of Florida in the mid-1990s. Dr. Shofner, who was department chair at the time, was the first interim editor at UCF, and the lecture series was named to honor his contributions to Florida history, his work as an editor, his scholarship, and his service as past president of the Florida Historical Society. Dr. Shofner attended the first lecture of this series in 2013, but unfortunately his health did not permit him to be present for any of the other lectures. On April the 11th, 2017, he passed away. His lectures have continued and continue to grow. And for the first time this year, and you are all first-timers here, the first time we have had 2 lectures, one at noon and one in the evening. And this gives us 2 opportunities to engage with Florida history and meet the foremost historians of this state's history. There are several people we need to thank, and I hope I get everybody, but this doesn't happen without a lot of input from a number of people. We want to thank the Department of History, the College of Arts and Humanities, the College of Arts and Humanities Alumni Relations, and the UCF Interdisciplinary Studies for their help with hosting this event. There are a number of individuals who deserve special thanks as well. In the Dean's office, Heather Gibson, Kara Robertson, and Azella Santana helped us enormously. In the Center for Humanities and Digital Research, Dr. Mike Shire had input into this. In the History Department, the list is long. Syra Ambrosekia, Alicia Campbell, Tiffany Rivera, Kayla Campana, Jeffrey Cavero, and special thanks, and I do mean special thanks, go to Rachel Mungovan, who is the FHQ intern for this semester. Among the other things that she did, she was in charge of corresponding with the 6 scholars presenting this afternoon and this evening, and I thank her so very, very much because she's done an excellent job. I think I should also thank one other person who's here who kind of came in at the last minute. The programmer for the Riches Project, Kurt Lundgren, helped us out here with our immediate technical problems. In the audience, we have a couple of people I want to recognize as well. The Associate Executive Dean is here, Dean Lyman Brody. And we also have a guest, Julian Boyden, who is a businessman and donor to UCF and a graduate of the History Department. He received an MA in our program, and the title of his thesis was A Historical Study of Southern Antebellum Public Attitudes and Motivations Towards Secession. Welcome back to UCF. Now, let's get on with the day, and let me introduce the three presenters and the panel moderator. Dr. Mike Gunter Jr. is a Cornell Distinguished Faculty member and Arthur Vining Davis Fellow who teaches courses on environmental politics, sustainable development, and international security at Rollins College. His current project, Tales of an Ecotourist, makes a case for experiential learning as a route to better understand climate change. Gunter also serves as director of the Interdisciplinary International Relations Program, as well as an advisor to Rollins Washington Semester Program. He was Rollins' first faculty in residence and directed its living and learning communities whose programs link academic and social aspects on campus. Dr. Chris Willem specializes in modern U.S. history, environmental history, and the history of the U.S. South. His research has mostly examined the Everglades. He is finalizing a book manuscript on the creation of Everglades National Park entitled From Swamp to Wetland. His recent publications include Conservatives in the Everglades in the Journal of Southern History and For the Birds, Challenging Wilderness in the Everglades in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences. His next project looks at the history of marine preservation in Florida. Dr. Stephen Knoll teaches in the History Department at the University of Florida, where he has taught since 1992. He received his PhD from UF in 1991. He has published 3 books: Feeble-Minded in Our Midst, 1995, Mental Retardation in America, 2004, and most recently, Ditch of Dreams, The Cross-Florida Barge Canal and the Struggle for Florida's Future, 2009. Ditch of Dreams started through a grant from the State of Florida Department of Environmental Protection and was researched and written in collaboration with Professor David Tediger. Noel is currently working on 2 books, one on the continuing controversy over removing Rodman Dam from the Ocklawaha River and the other on the disability rights protest of the 1970s. Dr. Richard Plate is a lecturer in environment studies and interdisciplinary studies at UCF, and he will be our moderator for the day. He is a Central Florida native. He holds a PhD in interdisciplinary ecology from the University of Florida and degrees in English and engineering from Clemson University. So, a distinguished panel and obviously a lot to talk about today, and let's get on with it. All right, Dr. Gunter.
Thank you, Dr. Lester, and special thanks to the Florida Agricultural Society and UCF and my savior from IT. Let's see here, from the beginning. All right, so I'm sort of the climate change portion of the afternoon panel. And as you may have heard, things are getting a little warmer. We have data, traditional modern temperature gathering data that goes back to the 1880s that shows, in particular, in the 21st century, it's been getting warmer. And this graph maybe helps demonstrate that all the more. Is it okay if I move away from the mic, or do you need me on the mic? It's okay. All right. That's 100 plus years. We can actually go back even further when we start to do some other things involving tree core sampling and ice core sampling, but in the interest of letting my colleagues have their share of time, I've edited this. Be happy afterwards when we all finish to go into more detail if you like and show you some of that. There's some pretty interesting material out there, including some of the famous, if you ever saw An Inconvenient Truth, when Al Gore got on the mechanized stairwell and showed what's happened over the last 100 years in terms of how that stands out. Anyway, to get to Florida, there are a couple places around the world that could lay claim to being ground zero in terms of climate change. One of them is actually Antarctica, which I had the opportunity to visit about a decade ago. And the reason is that the poles were seeing a lot more evidence of warming. It's happening at a much faster rate. And in that context, if you think about the United States, Alaska could also make a claim to being ground zero for climate change. And I had the opportunity to spend a month this past summer up there interviewing climate scientists and park rangers about the impacts that they've been studying and witnessing themselves. And really, if you look at the temperature gathering data isolated for the state of Alaska, they've seen a 6-degree Fahrenheit increase over the last 50, 60 years in that state. Just remarkable warming and what that means for the infrastructure of that state, as well as the increased chances of fire because of the drought that's happening. And in fact, the day before I landed in Anchorage on July 5th, the day before, on July 4th, Independence Day, they set an all-time record in Anchorage for the highest temperature ever. So these are lots of places that could lay stake to being ground zero, but we in Florida also have claim, as you well know, and I'd be happy to get into some of this. But there are a few different reasons why we lay claim, and it depends on where you live. In Orlando area, where we are today, these are the top 5 threats due to climate change. If you go towards the coast or towards South Florida, this list changes a little bit. In particular because of sea level, I think. We'll hear a little bit more probably about sea level from our next presenter. But in particular, Florida is feeling the heat, literally. We are not just the sunshine state in terms of all the benefits that provides, but we're getting hotter and hotter. And this is a nice slide by a group called Climate Central that I wanted to call your attention to, because just because it's getting hotter doesn't mean we set record lows too. And you can see over the last 130 years, we continue to set record lows, but we set a lot more record highs. A little aside on this. So we're talking about temperature. Temperature is a product of weather. And if you have 30 years worth of weather data, then you can start to talk about climate. And that's why it's important to go well beyond this year, last year, the year before. All right. And in particular, there are a lot of ways you can break down this data. In particular, it's interesting to note how many more danger days we're having. So it's not just that it's getting hotter, but we're having extreme heat. And the impacts that have in terms of stagnant air, you see here, once again, top 3 cities are in the United States happen to be here in our state. But you maybe heard a little bit about this also. We're not just talking about heat during the day, we're talking about problems that presents at night. And interestingly enough, the chart for Orlando doesn't look that bad. Tampa is, again, this story that there's different impacts from climate change depending on where you are, even just within the state of Florida. But you see that Tampa is in particular struggling with the impacts at night from the climate change underway. And again, basically we are going to become a year-round mosquito climate state. All right. So the problem here that we often point the finger at is fossil fuels and carbon dioxide emissions from using those fossil fuels, namely oil and coal. But really, when we're talking about climate change, it's much more than simply things are getting warmer. It's the impact that that warmth has on water. And that's where we can come full circle back to the slide that I started Florida off with in terms of Hurricane Irma, but any hurricane in general. So this explains why when it gets warmer, there's more water that gets evaporated into the air, and seemingly paradoxical things like more drought and more flooding can happen, sometimes in the same place. But it also means, here's a slide on more U.S. downpours, and you see that we are not immune to that. Although we have some examples of regulation in Florida that has been much more progressive than, say, Houston, and helped us deal with the fact that we require permeability on residential plots on the order of 40 to 50%, depending on how many stories your private property building is. And Houston, they didn't have that, and so when Hurricane Harvey comes into Houston, it devastates the area that's been paved over, where places like Orlando and Winter Park were better prepared for storms that hit us. Of course, who plans for 50 inches of rain in basically a 24-hour period? So you see here that in Florida, we are at risk for more inland flooding. But really what gets attention, because of the extensive coastline, after Alaska, the largest coastline in the U.S., are our cities and tourist destinations along the coast. So not so much an issue for Orlando, but definitely an issue for a number of places. Places where I've had the opportunity to speak with Mayor in St. Augustine, City Manager in St. Augustine, all the way down to, of course, infamous South Florida and the issues. This is actually, I think, Sarasota. But there's a few things going on here with sea level rise. You can see that on average, what we've faced the last 31 years, it's about a 6-inch sea level rise. And looking at the coast, the eastern coast of the United States, it's actually a little bit higher. It's more around 8 inches. There are a couple reasons for this. Remember, we said things are getting warmer. What happens when things get warmer? Water expands. There's also some settlement issues. This is particularly can be an issue in places like Louisiana. There's issues about the Gulf Stream in terms of how it's not pulling as much of the water away. But the big one, as you have heard, is what's happening in Antarctica and Greenland in terms of the melt of the ice that's on land. So melting in the Arctic, that is an issue, but it's not adding to sea level rise unless it's ice that's already on land. And here's the number I mentioned to you. So all across Florida, we're seeing an 8-inch rise in sea levels, and it gets even higher if you go up into the Northeast and over on the Texas coast. But this is a map of what things could look like towards the end of this century. Again, there's winners and losers when it comes to climate change. So, it's going to be a shorter drive for us to the beach. And count that as a win. But here's another example of you could say maybe there's degrees of losing. So Tampa is going to be 3 times more likely in the next 30 years to have a 100-year flood. But look at this. Whoops. All right, we're already seeing that. This is sunny day flooding. We used to call it nuisance flooding. This is in the Tampa area. So it's in particular a threat during high tides. But here's what I thought was coming next. Miami, 100 times more likely. So again, it depends on where you are. This is relative. And Miami's dealing with this on a pretty regular basis. In fact, Miami Beach spent, I think it's pushed over $500 million now, approaching $600 million on a system of pumps to extract that water on sunny days during high tides, as well as raise the street several feet, so raise street levels. And that's projected, according to Mayor Philip Levine, to get them to 2050. And then they have to start over. So as you see, we're already paying the cost of climate change. Am I doing all right on time? Paying for the cost of climate change, and it's affecting huge chunks of the population here in our state. Our environment is changing. And as we mentioned, Miami Beach has been a focal point for a lot of that discussion. All right, despite that, we continue to build, oftentimes in areas that are vulnerable and have questionable resilience in terms of ability to withstand storms. And basically, we're talking at about 3.5 million people in our state are vulnerable to these storms. And that costs money. And increasingly, we've come to realization that costs money. And in fact, this agency that I'm sure some of you have heard of recognized that for a long time the resistance to climate change was whether you focus on adaptation or mitigation. So whether you focus on seawalls to adapt to the climate change like St. Augustine has, or if you focus on mitigation like Orlando has with former UCF alum Chris Castro helping Mayor Buddy Dyer in Orlando run point on this in terms of moving off of fossil fuels. That's mitigation, trying to decrease the impacts of climate change, not just deal with the problems that it's presenting. Moody's has recognized that yes, it costs money to come up with responses to climate change, but if you don't react to that, if you don't spend money, you could be spending a lot more. This is actually a cartoon that was done 10 years before Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina in 2005, this is a cartoon that I used in my first book. In 1995 is when the cartoonists developed this. And of course, there's an argument that we have so much more to lose if you're just talking in terms of economics. And so what Moody's began to do almost 2 years ago, November 2017, is to announce that they're now going to rate cities that want to take out their creditworthiness. The ability of cities to get loans is now going to be, for the last 2 years, rated according to their climate change plans as well. So Florida and Texas in particular are states that need to take notice of this new way of becoming eligible for loans. I will stop there in the interest of time. Like I said, I'm happy to talk much more extensively about impacts here in Florida. From any of the slides that you saw that you would like to flesh out more, feel free to ask them in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so my name is Dr. Chris Wilhelm, and I'm going to talk today about what I'm calling Grassroots Environmentalism, which is kind of a corny thing to call something, but it kind of works. And what I mean by this is a variety of modern environmentalism situated in Florida's marine environments. That's kind of what I mean by this, and by the end I think you'll see what I'm talking about. So, as Mike noticed, Florida has a lot of coast. It has more coast than any other state in the continental US. It has 1,350 miles. If you're just drawing straight lines, if you're actually including all the bays and inlets, it has over 8,000 miles. It also has more coastal waters than any other state in the continental United States. And there you can see the state waters and the federal waters. And those waters have been the sites of a lot of development. People want to live next to the coast. People want to live on the water. What you can see here is Boca Ciega Bay in Tampa. This was often kind of touted or criticized as one of the really negative ways of developing a coastal area in the 1950s. And this is the type of development we're talking about, that I'm going to talk about today. So this is the development in Boca Ciega in the 1950s. What I'm going to talk about is Estero Bay in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Estero Bay, at the very top of this map is Fort Myers, and at the very bottom is Naples. So Estero Bay is that area in the middle. In 1961, there is a proposal to dredge and fill in Estero Bay, and you can see here on your right is the actual dredge permit, and there's a kind of there's a solid line and there's a dotted line. On the left is a Google Map image, and what I've done is I've drawn that dotted line in red. The solid line represents the extent to which a developer wanted to fill, and the red line is the extent to which they were going to dredge. So the plan was to dredge out to that red line and fill everything up to that dotted line. The solid line would have represented 5,000 acres of fill along an 11-mile boundary. The dredge line is an additional 1,000-acre area along an 18-mile line. The extent to which they were going to dredge was down to a 12-foot level. So they were going to dig essentially 12 feet down into the bay to create that fill. It's about a 6,000-acre bay area that was going to be completely filled for housing developments. The plan was to create 17 million cubic yards of fill. This would completely transform the bay. And in response to that permit, in response to that proposal, a group of people came together and formed an organization called the Lee County Conservation Association. And this is really the central group in what becomes kind of a statewide effort to protect the state's waters. The main individual here was a guy named Bill Meller, who really kind of got his friends together and their families together and really started fighting this development. All of these people were native Floridians. They were native Fort Myers residents. These were all people born in the area in the 20s, lived there throughout the Great Depression. Most of them fought in World War II. They all came back to the area after World War II. This is really where they're from, which in Florida is kind of rare. Most people in Florida are not from Florida. These are the residents of this area. All of them are really connected to nature. You look at the lives of these people, the economic activities of these people. Lots of them are commercial fishers. Some of them own nurseries. Bill Meller, all these guys grew up fishing and boating in these waters. This is kind of the nature they grew up in that they want to protect. It's also a very grassroots fight. These are kind of ordinary citizens. And they're very successful at gaining a lot of political power. At one point, the LCCA included a majority of the county's taxpayers as members. They actually put members of their organization on the county commission. Their state representative was a member of their organization. They're tied to their local senators. And they have connections all throughout the state as well. They have all these connections with the State Highway Patrol. They had connections with the Department of Education. All these connections that they kind of drew upon and became a very powerful group of people. They were also very scientifically informed. These were a group of people who were not scientists themselves, but drew on scientific knowledge. One of their really important allies was a guy named Martin Marshall, who later in the 70s and 80s became a very important Everglades advocate. He kind of actually got his start in activism fighting against these coastal developments. And then Ken Woodburn is another really important scientist who was the head of Florida's Marine Laboratory. So they're very politically connected, they're very connected to nature, and they're very scientifically connected as well. The LCCA made a variety of arguments concerning why we should protect these marine landscapes. They made a number of legal arguments. So I don't want to get super technical here, but I have to get a little technical. So the argument they are making is that all state lands underneath the mean high water line are called sovereignty lands. Those lands are owned by the state of Florida by virtue of the state's sovereignty. So when the state becomes a state, it gets all those lands. And the boundary between those state waters and those private lands is the mean high water line. Today, that's very basic. If you study land law or water law, property law, that's how things are. That's the way things are, and that's the way things were. But that principle was not really being honored in the states or respected in the state until the LCCA came along, did a bunch of legal research, and started presenting this argument to politicians and bureaucrats. They also made a number of ecological arguments about these lands. They argued that these lands were important nursery grounds and breeding grounds for fish and birds. They're essentially making what we would call today ecosystem services arguments. And they're also appealing to fishers and tourists and residents concerning the beauty of these lands. If you're a commercial fisher, you understand exactly why these waters are useful. If you are a longtime resident or a new resident, you understand the value of these waters. In a way, what these activists were saying was, look, these waters are the goose that lays the golden egg. This is why people want to come to Florida. Let's not destroy the very thing that makes this area beautiful. And so, after a period of years, they're making these arguments over a period of years. In 1961, they successfully blocked that dredge and fill permit. And they proposed making a state park. And this is kind of one of the really important issues here. No one's really heard of a water state park. What is that? What does that mean? What is that going to look like? When we think of preservation, we're often thinking of preserving pieces of land. And we have management regimes for land. We have national parks, we have national forests, we have state parks. But we don't really have good models to preserve bodies of water. They kind of are sitting there scratching their heads trying to figure out, well, what do we call this thing? What rules should it have? How do we actually protect a piece of water? Because no one had really done this before. There wasn't a long history of marine preservation. And in 1966, what eventually happens is they create what's called an aquatic preserve. The creation of the aquatic preserve is really born out of two things. It's the LCCA, but at the same time they're fighting their fight, there's also a movement within Florida state government to kind of reorganize all the state park, agriculture, fishery agencies, and at the same time to kind of create more recreational opportunities. The state of Florida is kind of sitting here in the 60s saying, we need more state parks for tourists, we need more state parks for residents, we need more recreation. And so those forces converge in 1966 with the creation of Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. And you can see here a map. On your right is their actual map from '66. This is what they think they're creating. The image on the left in blue is what they actually created. What they said was this preserve will encompass all the sovereignty lands. And so it goes to the mean high water line. They don't know what the mean high water line is in 1966 because really none of Florida's coast had been surveyed to actually find the mean high water line. And then later, I think in 1983, the green part is added, and that's an addition to the preserve. Okay, so awesome, great. Good job for these guys. They protected Estero Bay. Okay, nice. That's nice. They don't stop there. Here's Oh, well, I'm going to skip this slide because that transition was good. They don't stop there. They keep going, and in 1967 they write a law called the Randall Act. This is actually written at Bill Meller's dining room table. They all get together and actually write this bill, give it to Ted Randall, who's their state representative, and he passes it. And the Randall Act is really an amazing law. It does a couple things. Number one, it modernizes Florida's sovereignty land management. Essentially, before 1967, the state was giving these lands away. The state actually gave away free fill. If you wanted to go into the state waters and get fill, you didn't even have to pay for it. The state would literally give it to you away for free. And they're selling these lands for a song. And this really ends that giveaway and modernizes that process. It also sets a procedure if you're going to apply for a dredge fill permit or a land sale or a bulkhead line. A bulkhead line is the line out to which a private landowner can fill. And so to get any of those permits, you now have to hold a public hearing. You have to conduct a biological survey. The permit has to be in the public's interest, and it could not interfere with marine life. That's pretty amazing. This is one of the earliest laws protecting marine biology. The other thing it does one other thing. It also directs the state, the IIF, the Internal Improvement Fund, which is a very powerful state agency. It directs them to create a state system of aquatic preserves. And between 1968 and 1970, they create 26 of these preserves. Here is the proposed system of preserves in 1966, and that's just a map of one of them, just so you can kind of see what it would have looked like. Again, they don't actually know what the mean high water line is, so they're kind of just saying, all right, when we figure it out, that's what it'll go up to. And so they create 26 of them initially. Today, there are 41 of them that protect 2.2 million acres of state waters. And just to tell you a little more, I'm going to now do that slide I skipped. The regulations in these preserves is pretty minimal. Basically, the state can't sell land, the state can't authorize dredging and filling, and that's basically it. Fishing is totally allowed, hunting is allowed, boating. There's no other restriction other than we're not going to destroy those marine habitats, which is kind of a response to these ecosystems themselves. The goal is really to protect these habitats here. I just find it really interesting. You might be a boater going in these waters every week and never know you're in an aquatic preserve because they're protected in this kind of minimal way. The LCCA doesn't stop there either. They do quite a bit more. The LCCA also, they're not just these activists only concerned with their backyard. They are working to create a statewide network of these types of marine environmental activists. Art Marshall and Ken Winburn are kind of playing an important role in linking a lot of these activists together. But there's three other major fights that the LCCA is kind of tangentially involved in, or at least talking with these people. The expansion of Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, which is the nation's first wildlife refuge, created in 1903. It's only 5.5 acres when Teddy Roosevelt creates it. These guys expand it to be 5,400 acres, mostly state waters. The creation of Biscayne National Monument in 1968 is also connected to these concerns, as well as the creation of the Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which I wish they had a shorter name for that, because that's really long. The NBNERR, I mean, come on. And there's dozens of other smaller fights that they're involved with as well, all up and down the coast, both coasts, trying to prevent these types of developments. Here you can see a couple maps. You can see the Rookery Bay, Biscayne National Park, and Pelican Islands. So these activists are very successul in altering the state's approach to these waters. You create these preserves, and that's usually not the end of the story. In 1972, there's an announcement of a new planned development in the bay. There's a $500 million investment to dredge 5,400 acres and build 20,000 residential units in the Aquatic Preserve. The Lee County Conservation Association snaps back into action. A multi-year investigation, including Florida Senate hearings, find that the company that was going to do these developments hired a surveyor who actually created a fraudulent survey that gave landowners 3,750 acres of state waters. They found that the cabinet staff had rubber stamped, literally taken a rubber stamp of the cabinet member's signature and rubber stamped these deeds. And there were also a bunch of rumors of bribes. This became a pretty big scandal. And eventually, it didn't actually go away until 1981. 1974, 3 laws were passed as a result of this investigation, one of which was the Coastal Mapping Act of 1974, which was really the first time the state systematically decided to survey the mean high water line. And then it kind of ended up ultimately resolved by a Florida Supreme Court case in 1981, which I think was a pretty, I'm not a legal scholar, but my impression reading the literature is that this was a pretty important landmark case that upheld the municipal government's ability to protect the environment. So these activists had a very long career, 20 years plus, of fighting for these coastal waters. So just to sum things up, again, with this kind of idea of sea grassroots environmentalism, these activists were grassroots, but they weren't just these kind of NIMBY, not in my backyard types. They had much broader concerns about the whole state. These were scientifically and legally informed activists. And really, if you look at the arguments they're making and the solutions they're proposing, these ideas really are situated in the specific context of these marine environments, which are totally different than protecting a forest or a park. These marine environments pose all kinds of new questions. What are you protecting? How are you protecting it? And so these are kind of the first people in Florida really trying to come up with answers to these questions. How do we protect Florida's waters? All right, thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. My wife went to FTU in 1973. It's a little different place now than it was then. So, yeah. She's sad she couldn't make it here today, but I took pictures as I went around the campus, and she'll have no idea that this place is where she went to school. So, with that, my talk is broad as opposed to the narrow focus that these guys have. So, 6,000 years of history, and I'm going to go for 5 minutes. So, let's see what we got. This is Florida. As we see, Florida has the largest water area than any state in the continental United States. And underlaying Florida is this Floridan aquifer, which is just a great name. Sounds like some guy, Floridan. You know, I don't know who this guy is, but and it was only found and discovered in the 1930s, which I thought was really interesting. And under South Florida is this thing called the Biscayne aquifer, which underlays southeast Florida and is very close to the surface. So interesting underlaying geography and topography and hydrology of this state. Much of Florida, much more than we like to think, is this system called the Everglades. When we think of the Everglades, we think of Everglades National Park in the southern part of the state. Everglades really starts here in Orlando. Starts, basically right around Disney, flows into the Kissimmee River, which flows into the Great Lake Okeechobee, and then flows in what Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wonderfully calls the River of Grass into Florida Bay in the south part of the state. And it is a unique system, different than any system in the world, and makes Florida unique in that aspect as well. Rivers, Florida not necessarily known for being a riverine state, but mostly known for being a coastal state, but rivers provided the first method of transportation into the state, particularly the St. Johns, because the St. Johns connects to the ocean in Jacksonville. We also have the Swanee up north, but the Swanee connects to the Okefenokee, which no one wants to go to, and it connects to a part of the state on the shoreline called the Big Bend. So the Swanee, though almost as long as the St. Johns, the Swanee really doesn't have much impact on transportation. It does have an impact, however, on the state song, old folks at home, even though Stephen Foster never came to the state. The other major river is the Apalachicola in the Panhandle, which we'll talk about later. Water battles with Alabama and with Georgia. Many of these rivers are connected to the springs, which are kind of the centerpiece of North Central Florida's environment. North Central Florida's claim to fame, as it were, because of the porous limestone underlaying much of Florida. These springs percolate up and provide these wonderful windows into the aquifer, discovered by white people as early as William Bartram, who comes here, and much of the discussion about Kubla Khan with the English Romantic poets comes from William Bartram's discussion of these in his travels in the 1770s and 1780s. Florida also is, as we know, a coastal environment, and the interesting thing, I think, is that coastal environments are always changing. We build on the coast because we expect it to be permanent. The coasts are always changing, always revitalizing themselves, and also, providing a way for protection of mainland Florida from flooding and also from hurricanes. And Florida has the only naturally occurring coral reefs in the continental United States, from into many of these from Dade County, but mostly in Monroe County through the Florida Keys. So that's kind of an overview of what Florida and its relationship to water looks like. This is what Florida looks like in a map as Europeans attempt to, what they say is discover what we know is either conquer or conquest into Florida in the 16th century. And much of what they talk about is about water. As Ponce de Leon comes here 1513, and what's he looking for? The fountain of youth, okay? And certainly that has to do with water. And so from earliest European contact, Florida and its relationship to water has an important understanding of why these Europeans are here. And at some point, 1821, Florida becomes part of the United States as a territory, and we begin to see penetration into interior Florida, and that penetration is done on the water. This is a steamer on the St. Johns, and the relationship between humans and Florida is a long-standing one. We won't talk necessarily about indigenous peoples who radically, at some level, reshape the environment, but certainly not nearly as much as Europeans and Americans do in the last century and a half. So that's what we'll focus on that. And certainly that starts with the St. Johns and the water. And Florida's tourist industry, which Disney could be anywhere. It could be in North Dakota, right? It could be in Nebraska. But Florida's original tourist industry is strictly related around water, around places like Silver Springs, places like Wakulla, places in which people want to get away from the industrialization and urbanization of the late 19th century. Wealthy Northerners come down here and they're amazed by the subtropical beauty of these springs and rivers, the Ocklawaha, the St. Johns, but the springs that lead into them. The glass bottom boat is invented in Florida in 1878 so people can glide over these springs and just take in the beauty of this translucent fairyland, as they call it. But, Florida is among the poorest states in the Union at this point. 1883, the state is broke, and as we heard before, the Internal Improvement Fund needs money. So what better way to get money for the Internal Improvement Fund than for someone, a wealthy northerner named Hamilton Distant. He's going to bail the state out $4 million. He's going to buy 4 million acres, and with that, he's going to dredge and fill. So what Chris talked about specifically with Bocaciega Bay has a long and kind of sordid history of people trying to dredge and fill to make Florida livable. You know, the problem with Florida is, at this point, there's too much water. And how are we going to get rid of it? We're going to dredge and fill so that people can live here. And from 1883 on with Hamilton Distant, who ends up going bankrupt, of course, ends up dying in a bathtub in Philadelphia. An irony here, you know, the water theme. We're not sure whether he killed himself because of his failure in Florida, but it makes a great story. His successor in this is Governor, wonderfully named Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, who governor from 1905 to 1909. He is going to drain the Everglades. Okay? And a series of canals leading from the Great Lake, the Miami Canal, the New River Canal, the St. Lucie Canal. He's going to drain these things, and once again, his dredges are unsuccessful, but significant concerns about the fact that we're going to dredge. The problem is not that we shouldn't do it. The problem is not that it is not environmentally sustainable to do it. The problem is we don't do it well enough. We don't have enough money. So among the greatest things that we can use to examine this thing are political cartoons. So just here's some great ones. And the Everglades were not drained, but we didn't learn. We just didn't do it well enough. And throughout much of the 20th century, Florida's battle with water, and water's the enemy. I mean, there's great promotional literature and movies made by the Army Corps of Engineers in which water is the enemy. And I think this is really important as we look at Florida's relationship to water throughout the 20th century. So we're going to progressive Florida, reclaiming the great Everglades. We're going to reclaim it. We're going to have opportunities for agriculture and for development throughout this, because the Everglades is, as we all know, a swamp that is useless and worthless. Okay? This, to me, is maybe the best slide of all. It's hard to see. This is what we're going to do for Florida. There's lots of manless land. Sorry about the gender notations here, but I didn't write this. Manless land, there's tons of it, for the landless man. So Florida is this opportunity to get people to come here in this land, which is available and cheap, but it's water-filled. And so our job to make this land accessible for landless men is to dredge and fill. So throughout much of the 20th century, this is what we do. You can see map of the Everglades Drainage District, all these canals designed to take water away and move it so that we can make the land accessible for agriculture and also for development and for people to live. And here you can see this wide range of dredging. People who are old enough to know these Rube Goldberg type contraptions which dredge out this stuff and move it and allow people to live in places where maybe they shouldn't be living. And certainly that gets into what Chris has been talking about on a specific level. 1935, we built a dike around Lake Okeechobee, the Hoover Dike, and we'll talk about why that was built. But that really radically reshapes the hydrology of South Florida. The lake had always overflowed every year and flowed south in that great land mass called the Everglades, that river of grass. Building the dike around that radically reshapes both the topography of South Florida and the hydrology, and at some level basically starving the Everglades of water. And dredging and filling, as you can see, this is, again, in an area very close to where Chris was talking about in the southwest coast. This is Cape Coral, which in 1947 was absolutely nothing. And everybody in Florida wants what? What do we want? Cheap tickets to Disney, yes, this is Orlando, we don't care. But what does everyone in Florida want? Waterfront property. Okay, everybody wants waterfront property, and so dredging and filling will allow that to happen. 1947, important year in Florida as far as what's going on with the Everglades, creation of Everglades National Park. The first time we have had a national park in which it's really about ecology, and Chris certainly knows that. It's not about wonderful vistas and beautiful mountains. It's about this strange land that needs to be preserved. In the same year, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas writes her seminal book called Everglades River of Grass, in which she shapes what the river is and how we use those words. It is no longer a swamp. It is a wide, slow, shallow river of grass. And that becomes, the mantra of what this river is, and changes our perception of what the Everglades is and why we need to save it. But also, huge flooding in 1947 in southeast Florida leads to the Army Corps of Engineers. High tide of American liberalism in the late 1940s. We can do anything. We beat the Nazis, we beat the Japanese. American comes out of World War II with economic surplus. Liberalism is about big ideas and big projects. We are going to radically reshape South Florida in what's called the Central and Southern Florida Project, this kind of innocuous sounding name that does what Broward and what Distant could not do. Lots of money, lots of technology. We're going to reshape Southeast Florida. We're going to change the hydrology and topography. And we're going to allow people to live there in numbers that were never there before. This is how we're changing this historic flow. This is how it's flowing now. You can see changing dramatically based upon what the Army Corps does. This is, if you drive south from Orlando on the turnpike through Yeehaw Junction, you will pass all these kinds of water structures, dams and controls and dikes. This is the result of the Army Corps of Engineers' long-term projects from the 40s into the 70s to allow people to really live in South Florida. And also for sugar to be grown. A euphemistically named area south of the Great Lake called EAA. Anybody have any idea what that might stand for? What's the E stand for? Everglades. Everglades agricultural area. This huge natural area was destroyed so that we could grow crops among the most fertile soil on earth, this muck, and they're growing tons and tons and tons of sugar, to the point that Clewiston, which is on the south shore of the lake, becomes known as America's sweetest town. And certainly after 1960, with the demise of Cuban sugar, with the ascension of Castro, this becomes profoundly important to feed America's sweet tooth. And this is Miami Lakes, once again. Interior in the Everglades, everybody wants waterfront property. This is areas in the Everglades that have been developed so that everybody can have waterfront property so that we can live the Florida dream. By the 1960s, and again, same time as Chris's discussion of what's happening in Lee County, this really important movement towards environmentalism and this oxymoron today, bipartisan environmentalism, something that today is almost unheard of, leads to the stoppage of two of the biggest public works projects in American history, both here in Florida, both to do with water. Number one, the Miami Jetport, built in the interior, 60 miles from Miami, was going to be connected to it by monorail. I guess Disney was involved in that, I don't know. And four environmental crusaders stopped this. Okay? Luna Leopold, son of the great ecologist Aldo Leopold. Joe Browder quits his job in Miami television to become an environmental activist. Nathaniel Reed, who just died last year, the first environmental secretary in the Florida cabinet, and a Republican. And, of course, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. They get together, issue an environmental impact statement, and they stop the building of this gigantic planned airport in the middle of the Everglades. And historic flow, current flow, and now we're spending billions of dollars to kind of revamp what the Army Corps of Engineers did in a program called CERP, Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, Restoration Program. The problem is we can never go back to the historic flow because there are millions of people living in South Florida who would be flooded out. So we can only approximate what that is, but if we don't do it, the Everglades will die. And certainly in the area around here, maybe the most egregious problem with the Army Corps of Engineers program was in the 1970s, the Kissimmee River, which is fairly close to here, this winding, natural, interesting river, turns into this flood control structure. And the Army Corps of Engineers is also very good at renaming stuff. So the Kissimmee River is renamed C-38 because good bureaucratic stuff. So this is what it looks like, maybe. Look at what it looks like today, because it probably cost $2 million. So just keep that amount in your minds. The other major project that was stopped was the Cross-Florida Barge Canal. Started in the 1930s, stopped by agricultural interest, revived in the 1960s by New Deal liberals who want to boost Florida's economy. Again, straightening and narrowing canal rivers and crossing the state with machines like the crusher crawler here. And this is also stopped at the same time that the jetport, late 60s, 1970s, by environmental activists like Marjorie Harris Carr. This is what remains of the destruction from this machine here. This is Rondon Reservoir, which is behind the Rodman Dam on the Aquatic River, which is where the canal would have been. You can see what we have done to this environment. Three Marjories. Interesting. The relationship of these people to environmental concerns. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings in her book Cross Creek about the relationship of Floridians to the natural landscape. Marjorie Harris Carr and her fight against the Cross-Florida Barge Canal, and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the mother of the Everglades, as it were. The most important people in Florida environmental movement in the 20th century. Water also is involved with individuals bringing stuff in. Late 19th century, we bring in water hyacinths from Japan because they're beautiful. They come to the New Orleans World's Fair. By the 1890s, they are controlling much of Florida's rivers, and we spend millions of dollars now to remove water hyacinths or bring in other exotic creatures that eat the water hyacinths that may be just as problematic or more problematic than the biota itself. In the 1960s, we have hydrilla problems again, and we spend millions of dollars trying to get rid of this stuff in Florida's waterways. You can see almost all of Florida has hydrilla problems except for the Panhandle, but we don't consider the Panhandle part of Florida. It's just lower Alabama. So quickly, hurricanes. Hurricanes are assumed to be a natural disaster. I would argue that they're a man-made disaster, that they are caused certainly by natural phenomenon, but they're exacerbated by humans building in places where they shouldn't be built. This is Flagler's Railroad Bridge at Holliver Inlet in 1926, the first hurricane that really causes significant damage to Florida. There's two major hurricanes in the 1920s that pretty much put the end to the Florida land boom. This is the Great Miami Hurricane in 1926 going across what is today's Miami-Dade. This is the great 1928 hurricane that goes through Palm Beach that has been so well documented by Zora Neale Hurston in her Their Eyes Are Watching God. 3,000 people killed by that hurricane, most of them migrant African-American workers living south of this is where that occurs. And thousands of Floridians, millions of Floridians have never experienced a hurricane. By the 1990s, there had been a hiatus in major hurricanes hitting the state. Oh, everything's good. And Andrew, in August of 1992, you can see it looks like bombs have hit. Profoundly reshaping building codes and everything else. But Floridians have short attention spans, and new people move here without any knowledge of the hurricanes. And in 2004, we have 4 hurricanes that basically crisscrossed the state, even hitting Gainesville. People died in Gainesville in 2004 because of hurricanes, which, I living there, it's just phenomenal. We thought, oh, we're far from the coast. We're not going to get hurt with this. These are pictures from Michael, taken by the great photographer John Moran from last year. You can see the results. And you can also see in this picture the results of building in places on barrier islands where we shouldn't be built. And certainly this was from Ivan in 2004. And now, because of Michael, there's a pass right here to showing us that these barrier islands are only temporary and shouldn't be built. Great picture tying into what Chris was talking about. natural wetlands versus waterfront property, and certainly these guys are hurricane protectors. These guys are hurricane, come on, hit us, we're here to be destroyed. More and more again, this is, again, everyone wants waterfront property. This is what happens when the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, 2009 hits. One house left, but we still have water there because everyone wants to live on the water. We talked earlier about the Apalachicola River, Florida fighting with Georgia and Alabama over water rights. The best oysters in America come from the Apalachicola Bay right here. Need a perfect amount of salinity and temperature to get there. That is being changed dramatically as Atlanta is, there they are, as Atlanta is pulling water out. And certainly the Supreme Court sides with Florida, dispute over Georgia over water rights, all the way to the Supreme Court. Who's going to win that? Apalachicola has less than 1,000 people. Atlanta has 7 million and needs that water. We all know how that's going to end, right? So certainly looking at how Florida and its relationship to the water is dependent upon, as Chris said, legal issues. Springs, I take my students to the springs, many of whom have never been there. They are amazed at how beautiful they are. And we all say, you should have seen them 20 years ago. You should have seen them 30 years ago. Over-pumping, development, pesticides, leads to this kind of stuff in the bottom there. This is from Ecotourist, which is the iconic state park of springs in north central Florida. This is the former spring house in White Springs on the Swanee River near Lake City. You see how low the water is. The water used to be here. People used to come here for bathing and for medicinal purposes. Now, this is even high from what it is now. There's almost no water in here at all. And certainly one reason is overpumping due to water and our desire to have bottled water at all times. Coral reef loss, you can see, and again, I'm parroting what Mike has said regarding changes drastically just in the last generation, how much of coral reefs have been lost in the past, our lifetime. This is what the Everglades restoration project looks like. Okay? And if you think what we did before was complicated, try to figure out what the hell we're trying to do. I don't know what that means, but what it means is that we are trying at some level to replicate what we had before. But of course we can't do that because people live there. Just look at this. And when we talked about the Kissimmee River and C-38, well, by the first years of the 21st century, we realized that was a big mistake. So it took $2 million to turn the Kissimmee River into C-38. It took $2 billion to turn C-38 back into the Kissimmee River, which we have done. And I would argue that it's money well spent because environmentalists and ecologists have all said the river and its estuarine and environment have gone back to its natural state much faster than we ever could have imagined, which tells us that nature can at some point fix the ills that we have done to it. Everglades still looking profoundly amazing. If you drive down there, at some point you may think it's still pristine. But Florida's waters are imperiled. We've gone from too much water to too little water. One reason is our obsession with lawns, and I took this picture at UF as we're watering the lawns here, make sure that they're nice so that their students, their children can go to UF instead of UCF, in the middle of a rainstorm, okay? Not only do we have people's backyards, we have golf courses, and certainly, golf courses are beginning to kind of die out as a phenomenon, but still the amount of water we need to keep those green is amazing, as is agriculture. Big agriculture is the largest user of water and pumping in the state. We certainly can, we don't want to do away with agriculture, but we certainly can use more sustainable methods rather than this kind of wasteful agricultural water. And then We talk about sea level rise and hurricanes, building where we shouldn't build, results of hurricanes, these places. And what are we going to do? Rebuild. We're going to rebuild there because people want to live on the shore. In the past 4 years, red tide has blue-green algae blooms have come out of Lake Okeechobee. As the lake is high, we have to pump out. The water contaminated by pesticides has made for horrific environments on both the east and west coast, to the point where you can almost walk on this green pea soup that is, again, if we want to have Florida as a place that people come to for tourism, hey Mom, come down here, look at this. Really? I don't think so. Last year, great red tide outburst. You can see what looks like millions of fish again dying. But the interesting thing is that red tide is a naturally occurring phenomenon. And this is, I got this out of the Fort Myers newspaper from 1955. Red tide dates back to the 1800s, okay? So red tide has always been around. It's a naturally occurring phenomenon. However, it's like the movement of it and the ability to change and the ability of it to have more red tide and deeper red tide is exacerbated by human contact. So while it's always been around, certainly what we have done is made it worse over time. And then, quickly, what Mike has said, that great elephant in the room, or the great manatee in the room, maybe, sea level rise, that's what it's going to look like. What's going to look like? Trouble in paradise, okay? All this stuff. However, people still love it, because it's still paradise. So, thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions for our panel?
Hi.
It'll all be on the exam, so ask questions.
Yeah. I think it was Chris who mentioned ecosystem services. Is that right? My understanding of that that idea is that you value all of the benefits of a healthy environment, right? So, but it's also tied in with culture, history, is that right? And I guess my question is, what is that, and how widely accepted is that as a kind of model for thinking about future development, I guess at a political level or at a local level?
Yeah, so I guess the idea of ecosystem services is that ecosystems provide economic benefits to humans. And those are diverse. It can be as much as, the bay is an important nursery ground for fish. The fish have an economic value to a commercial fisherman, but it can also be things like, if you don't cut down the mangroves, then you have some mitigation for storms, and there's an economic value there as well. So I think it's a pretty solid idea that's come out of the science of ecology. I don't think it's as important politically as it should be, in part because the benefits of the ecosystems are diffused, whereas the value in a developer tearing those mangroves down to put a piece of land is an individual benefit. And also, I think the ecosystem services, the benefits are long-term, and they're hard to see. It's hard to know that, it's hard to measure, this marsh is going to provide me with, some storm mediation in the case of a hurricane. So it's really hard to measure and make visible the ecosystem services, and I think in the way we make decisions politically, we tend to value the immediate individual profit, and we tend to put the costs off on the public. And so I think it's a solid ecological idea, but it's not, I think, as appreciated as it should be in the political sphere. So maybe that answers.
So thank you. My question was inspired by Chris's presentation, but it's maybe for everyone. I actually have a question about the slide that you skipped over. Right before you skipped it, it said novel preservationist regime, coming out of this notion of the Aquatic Preserve. And I'm really fascinated by this idea that a particular local problem that requires a novel solution, and you can kind of reconceptualizing of the landscape that then then becomes national in scope, right? So it starts out as this local challenge, like what are we gonna do? Someone comes up with a solution and then it takes on this national, I don't know, it has laws everywhere that, apply and actually help people in other parts of the country. It started in Florida from that landscape challenge. So I guess, is that a correct, would you agree? Is that kind of like what's happening? Is that how you frame it? And then I was curious if there are other examples in your research for anyone you've come across those kinds of things.
So that's the new research project I'm working on is marine environmental preservation in Florida. And one of the big problems that people have written about, scientists have mostly written about this, how do you protect the marine environments? Because it's tricky, what are the laws, what is it going to look like? Are you protecting the surface? Are you protecting the whole water column? And so in my research, I'm finding a lot of different ways that people are trying to do this. So the Aquatic Preserve is one. There's a national park, Biscayne National Park. There's that Rookery Bay, whatever reserve. There's John Pennekamp State Park. There's national marine sanctuaries. So I think it's a problem that people have come up with all kinds of solutions to try to solve.
It can then be used at a more national level than other places, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the National Marine Sanctuary has become, Obama did a huge one over in Hawaii that was just like, I think it's the world's biggest marine preserve. And that's been the big picture solution to it, yeah.
Everglades certainly, I think, is maybe the best example of it, because the Everglades is a new kind of national park. A national park that's not built on, gotcha, wonderful picture postcard thing. It's a national park that at some level is built on ecology, which maybe isn't used that much when they build it, but that word is not used, but that idea is. So, and certainly the ideas of the Marjories and their understanding of local as tied to national are really important.
And I think what they do also is they're situating what they want to protect in the environment that they want to preserve. So it's almost like they're allowing the environment to, in a way, dictate or influence what they're trying to do. Because one size doesn't fit all. You can't just have a national park everywhere. You have to take into account the peculiarities of the specific landscape and allow the landscape to maybe, I don't want to say agency, but in some ways, yeah, dictate what you're going to do to protect it.
Yeah, I'd say that oftentimes that's the problem, is that people have these ideas of best practices, overarching general game plan that they want to implement, a blueprint, and then they ignore the local particulars. And so that's where the sort of the merger of maybe some national funds and past experience with local knowledge is really important.
Dr. Wilhelm, I was really struck by when you talked about how at one point over half of the county was part of the Lee County Conservation Association, and I was really amazed to just try to imagine something like that happening today. And I was wondering if there were any lessons that we could perhaps try to implement today from that. I just moved here from Maryland, which is not known for being a particularly anti-government state. And you were talking about the National Marine Sanctuaries, and they've been trying to, I think they finally did implement in the Mallows Bay Marine Sanctuary, but there was a ton of pushback. They ended up having to really neuter a lot of what they wanted to implement, and that's in Maryland. So the idea of how could we even begin to try to get to a place where over half of the county would be in an environmental protection organization? How did that happen, and what can we do today, if anything?
The county was much smaller. I have some notes here. In 1940, Lee County was 17,000 people. By 1970, it's 100,000 people. Today, it's 600,000 people. So it was a smaller county, but still, that's amazing. Half the county taxpayers are members of this organization, and I think it's a testament to the grassroots nature of that campaign and to the type of people who were involved in it. It kind of was, the people involved in that were not the city elites, but they were kind of like the middle class, the upper middle class people that had a lot of connections. And I mean, that's one of the things in this story that I'm continually struck by is the power of these individuals. I mean, they put people on the county commission. They, had close contacts with their representatives. And I think it is a model for today. Where I live, I live in near St. Simons, Georgia, and one of the big controversies there is way too much construction. And if the people that cared about it would get together and have an organization, and they could stop it. But the power of people organizing is just, I think, vastly underrated.
I think one thing that's important is the notion of that word, conservation. It comes from the same root as conservatives. These are not wild-eyed, crazy, eco-freak type people. These are middle-class people concerned about their environment. And, ecology, Florida's changed dramatically because people come down here without that relationship to place. And, these people are fighting for this because this is their place. People move to Florida, their place is Wisconsin, their place is, Maryland, right? And, until they get that notion of place, something to conserve, they're not going to want to be involved. And certainly I think this notion of environmentalism as a fringe leftist thing has changed dramatically. In the 1960s, as I said, bipartisan environmentalism. If you read Richard Nixon, never known to be a great, read his State of the Union address in 1970. Just read it. And today, if a Republican said that, they would accuse of wearing a red shirt and being a communist. There's absolutely no doubt. I mean, our right to have clean water cannot be stopped. We must have clean water, whatever the cost. And that's gone, and trying to figure out why that's gone is really interesting. And in order for this stuff to work, it has to come back. And I think it starts with place. It starts with role.
Sitting here thinking, what can we in this room do, small things now, whether it's advocating or spreading awareness. And the irony isn't lost on me that we're all sitting here with bottles of water in front of us, and it's across campus, and every time I open one, I feel bad, but convenience is there, and you open it. So what can we do on a daily basis now? And then speaking up, I think of how we've added the landfill taglines on all of the garbage cans and things like that. Is there an awareness level there we can just start communicating? Because we all have large universities behind us. We've got these young leaders coming out. What can we do to help change?
I think the key is electing people. Government matters. Government matters. And the fact that these guys, the laws that they passed, when you look at what laws were passed in the period from 1965 in Florida to 1975, unbelievable laws. And this is just one of them. Comprehensive land use plans, all because a legislature was committed to doing this. People like Bob Graham. The irony about Bob Graham, who is maybe Florida's most environmentally friendly governor, is that picture of Miami Lakes, that's his family doing it. So there's, but certainly I think, small things matter. And, we can laugh about, cutting down water consumption or getting rid of green lawns. That stuff matters, but government matters as well. So I think the two things, and trying to convince conservative people that we're on the same side, that if you want to live in Florida, and one reason you came to Florida, well, besides warm temperatures and low taxes, is because it's beautiful. That's going to be gone if you don't start thinking about it. And getting people on the same wavelength is important, without political connotations.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Another one, sorry. I have a question about sea level rise, actually. So I understand that, I guess I'm looking for an easy answer to the question of what do your predictions look like by 2100? And I realize the problem with that is that it's it's so, I've read such varying information. Some people say 8 inches, some people say 15 feet, right, in between those two. The other problem is, it's not the same, of course, locally, right, as your presentation pointed out. It's going to feel very different and be very different in different places. And then we also know, of course, that climate change involves so many different competing amplifying factors that how can you predict it? So I think this question actually ties into your question too, which is like, once you start explaining that to someone, their eyes are going to glaze over and they're going to say, you know what, let's not worry about it then, it's probably going to be fine. So how do you like get the response from someone where they say like, oh, that we need to do something now,
Right.
without reducing all the real complexity that is in fact the truth about that question?
That's tough. Environmental groups have been struggling with that for a long time. I think one theme that has emerged is you're not going to make any headway telling someone that they're wrong, and that they're selfish, or that they're not thinking about your children and their children and the future generations. What you have to do is you have to find common ground. Common ground that this is a beautiful state, and we'd like to continue to be a beautiful state. I had the opportunity to interview a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, Bob Inglis, who lost office after he had an epiphany about kind of 10 years ago and changed his position on climate change. But he's still very active. He actually won Kennedy Courage Award 3-4 years ago for continuing to take the position that, yeah, he lost his seat, but he's very active in the climate change arena, articulating a conservative voice for why action is needed. And I think this environmental issues have historically been a bipartisan issue, but over the last, I really kind of trace it to Congressman Gingrich in the early to mid-1990s. So really over the last couple decades that has changed. And they've become like a number of other issues, such as gun control, very polarizing political point in the United States. And I think that you have to break through that polarization, and the way you do it is you find that common ground. So back to your question, that's where some of the stuff I've been writing about recently is building on something that's been hot in academia for the last 10-15 years, and experiential learning. You go and you see it yourself. You see that you have a connection to it. Maybe it's simply a financial connection. There's a lot of shades of green, the environmentalist community says. There's economic reasons to be interested in this, as I was trying to finish my slides with. Yes, this costs money, but there's a lot more money to be lost if we don't take action now. So I think there are different routes. You can take the ethical, moral route, you can take the financial route, but the key is that you have to build a common ground, and you can fight about what the specific policies are from the ideology, from the political spectrum, but you can't fight about the facts like sea level is rising, climate is changing. We're probably not going to have more hurricanes, the scientists say, but they are going to be more intense because of that graphic that I showed you about water evaporation and heat. So that's what I would emphasize, the common ground.
So we're one more.
Could I just speak to that a moment? I don't think anybody who is rational looks at those numbers and doesn't believe that global warming is occurring. I don't think anybody believes that it doesn't occur because of man-made intervention. Surely the big disagreement is finding rational solutions to cure it. I'll just give you one example. You talked about fossil fuels causing the problem, and you're absolutely right. But it's hardly helpful. I would suggest, for example, that if you wanted to slow the growth in global warming, you would burn more natural gas, not less. We just take Germany, for example. They close their nuclear power stations, and what do? They burn brown coal, which is about the worst possible thing you can use for the environment, despite having a huge green movement. You see the same in Poland, 50% of their energy from coal. India is much the same. I think it's about 70% of their power comes from coal. We would do far better, it seems to me, and make the far biggest dent Firstly, if we stop people having natural gas, having more natural gas and stop burning coal, then we were doing things like electric cars or self-driving cars. I mean, it's going to take a massive amount of time, it seems to me, for the public to adjust to self-driving cars. I mean, Luddites like me, we've hardly got used to our lives driving, never mind electric cars, cars that are self-driving.
So there's a lot there. There's parts that I would agree with and parts that I would point in a different direction. The first is, it depends on the year and the episode, but if you look at the last 25 years of public opinion data on climate change in the United States, we're up and down. And we've been improving lately, but I could point to just 2 years ago data that shows we're roughly 50-50 on whether even thinking there's such a thing as climate change in the United States. We're an anomaly.
I did say no rational person.
Yeah, but we're an anomaly there. I mean, Australia and Russia are the only other places where that's even close, pretty much across the board. And as I said, things have improved the last 18 months in terms of where public opinion is. In fairness, I think the bigger issue now is not so much that it exists or that it's a problem. It's the public is worried about what government's role is going to be in addressing it. So it's become more about what are the policies. And to that, yes, natural gas of the fossil fuels is the preferred one. However, you could make an argument that some of the turn to natural gas under President Obama actually damaged greener alternatives in terms of a more quick movement to market, right? And then there are simple things that can be done at the subnational level, at the state level to encourage that. For instance, in Florida, we are the Sunshine State. I think after California and Hawaii, we are definitely the third, have the third highest potential for solar in the United States. But we stand at number 10 in terms of actual production. And the reason for that has to do with some antiquated regulations. And we've been seeing a spurt here in terms of solar productivity the last 5-6 years. Unfortunately, the federal tax credit starts to be phased down in a couple months. There's a 30% tax rebate now if you go solar. But there are steps. There are steps that at both the municipal and state level that can be taken without the current support at the national level to enhance that. So, long-winded answer to your question. Yes, we need bridge energies to get us where solar and wind can be in 20 years. And that is probably going to involve more natural gas, as you said, and then another no in the environmental community. But there are some that are articulating for it or advocating for it as nuclear power.
All right, on that, please join me in thanking all three of our panel members.
People want to buy my book on the cross-Florida Barge Canal. I've got them for sale for $20, and I'll be happy to sell them. Thanks for coming. Any questions?
Can you write down my